So you've been daydreaming about Australia, right? Sunshine beaches, the whole shebang, but then reality hits.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute, what's this going to cost? Is it even doable? And does it make a big difference if I'm going solo or bringing a partner along for the ride?
A huge question.
Huge. Well, you, our amazing listener, sent us a really useful resource, a YouTube video script, actually, that really dives into these costs.
Oh, cool.
And it breaks them down specifically for singles versus couples.
Nice.
So today's deep dive is all about pulling out those key financial realities for you.
Love it.
Pinpointing where you might see those big savings or maybe those surprise expenses, depending on whether you're flying solo or doing the duo thing down under.
Exactly. And what's great about these kinds of video scripts
Yeah.
is that, they're designed to get straight to the point,
Yeah.
address those like core financial questions right off the bat.
Yeah.
So it gives us this nice structure
Mhm.
for our deep dive, to get into the nitty-gritty of how those costs actually stack up for different living situations.
Oh, I love it. All right, so let's get right to it.
Let's do it.
And we're going to start with what is often the biggest bite out of your budget: rent and housing.
Makes sense.
So this script highlights that if you're single and you're looking at a one-bedroom apartment in a big city like Sydney or Melbourne, you're looking at probably 1,500 to 2,500 Australian dollars per month.
Wow. Okay.
So immediately, for couples sharing that same space, you're already thinking splitsies,
Yeah.
major savings.
Right off the bat.
Yeah, and it really does make a difference. And, it's interesting to think about. It doesn't always shake out to be a perfect 50-50 split in terms of like individual finances.
Oh, interesting.
So
Yeah.
sharing such a big expense can really change things up, right?
Totally. Yeah.
But the script also points out that if you venture beyond those major hubs, maybe check out Brisbane or Adelaide,
Okay.
the rent range for both singles and couples comes down a bit. So you're looking at 1,200 to 1,800 AUD per month.
So that's still pretty significant. Like that difference between like major city versus.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So it shows you how much just your location within Australia can impact your housing costs.
Total.
And that's regardless of whether you're single or coupled up. But I'm curious, what do you think contributes to that big difference, like those price gaps between cities?
I mean, it's got to be partly demand, right?
Yeah.
Like higher demand in those major cities.
Yeah.
Maybe more job opportunities are concentrated there.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's just like the pace of life is faster.
Yeah.
Everything costs more.
Yeah, like a premium on everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But what I found really interesting for singles in this script was the share house thing.
Oh, yeah. Share house.
It's like a big thing, right?
Absolutely.
So they suggest if you're willing to share a bigger place, like a 3-bedroom with some flatmates, you could potentially get your rent down to like 800 to 1,200 AUD per month.
That's a big difference.
Huge difference,
Yeah.
especially compared to that one-bedroom solo situation.
Totally.
So it really shows you there are different options out there, right?
Yep.
Especially if you're single, there are ways to be creative and manage those costs.
For sure. And, it's a classic trade-off, right?
Right.
You're sacrificing some privacy.
Yeah.
But the financial benefits can be huge.
Huge, yeah.
But it also makes you think, what kind of social dynamic are you stepping into?
Yeah.
So it's not purely financial, writing. It impacts your quality of life.
It's a whole lifestyle thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that indirectly can affect your budget in other ways.
Oh, for sure.
Right, so it's not just about the dollars and cents.
Right.
All right, let's talk about another daily essential: food.
Okay, the fuel.
Gotta eat.
Yes.
So the script suggests that for a single person in Australia, you might be spending about 300 to 500 AUD each month on groceries.
Okay.
And then for couples, it mentions a range of 500 to 700 AUD total for the household.
Interesting.
So why do you think it's not just double the single person's amount?
Well, I mean, it's got to be the bulk buying power. Right?
Yes, the classic Costco effect.
Exactly. When you're shopping for two, you can often buy those bigger quantities and get a lower price per unit.
Right.
So over time, those savings add up.
Yeah.
Assuming, of course, you're eating similar things, and you can avoid that dreaded food waste.
Right. Yeah, you gotta be a little more coordinated.
Yeah, exactly.
But, I mean, is bulk buying always realistic for couples?
That's a good point. I mean, it depends on their dietary needs, right?
Totally.
Storage space,
Yeah,
all
yeah.
those factors.
Right. Are there certain types of groceries where you see the biggest benefits from buying in bulk?
I would think those staples, right? Rice, pasta, maybe even meats if you have a big freezer.
Yeah.
That's where you're really going to see the savings.
Okay, so let's move on to the fun stuff. Eating out.
All right.
The script estimates a mid-range restaurant meal for two will set you back about 60 to 100 AUD.
Okay.
Whereas if you're dining solo, you're looking at about 20 to 40 AUD.
So pretty much double.
Pretty much so. It seems like it's a pretty straightforward doubling of the expense when you're with a partner.
Yeah. It is a pretty direct relationship there in terms of cost per meal.
Right.
But of course, how often you eat out is a
Right.
personal choice, right?
Yeah,
That's going to have a big impact on this part of the budget.
totally.
But, it makes you think about how being a couple can be tied to those social activities like dining out
Yeah,
and how that might affect the combined budget versus individual spending.
for sure. And speaking of things that can add up, we can't forget the cultural essentials.
Oh, yes.
The script mentions this almost jokingly.
Okay.
The flat white,
Oh, the Aussie class.
that quintessential Australian coffee experience.
It's a must,
It's non-negotiable, they say.
pretty much.
So it's a small daily expense, but over time,
It adds up.
it adds up.
It's a great example of how those little things, right,
Yeah.
the daily habits,
Yeah.
they really contribute to your overall cost of living.
Exactly. Whether it's a flat white for one or two, those little indulgences can really make a difference in the long run. Okay, so let's move on to some of the less glamorous but equally important costs. Utilities.
Right, the essential.
The essentials.
Yeah.
So things like electricity, water, internet.
Hmm.
The script gives a monthly range of 200, 300 AUD for singles,
Okay.
and then a little bit higher, 250 to 400 AUD for couples.
So not a huge jump.
Not a massive jump, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit more usage with two people. But I'm curious, why do you think the difference isn't bigger?
Well, I think about it like some things like the internet connection, that's a fixed cost, right?
Right.
You're just sharing it.
Yeah.
But then things like electricity and water, yeah, maybe you're using a little bit more with two people,
Yeah.
but it's not like it doubles, right?
No.
So I think there are some economies of scale, even with utilities,
Right.
where the cost doesn't perfectly multiply just because there are two of you.
Makes sense. All right. So what about getting around transportation?
Yeah. How are we moving?
The script estimates public transport for singles will be about 150 to 200 AUD per month. Now, for couples who might share a car, including things like petrol and insurance, they're looking at 250 to 400 AUD per month total.
Okay, so how they split that is up to them, of course.
Of course, yeah. But it is something to consider,
Right.
right? Because if a couple is sharing one vehicle, their transport costs could be lower than if they each had their own separate thing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right, but it's still a shared cost that needs to be factored into the budget.
Exactly.
Now, the script also brings up this really cool point about cities like Melbourne being super walkable.
Guys.
So they suggest that depending on where you live, you might be able to cut down on those transport costs significantly or even eliminate them.
Wow, that's amazing.
Right. Like, that's a big lifestyle benefit that directly impacts your bottom line.
Totally, yeah.
Okay, so let's try to put all these pieces together.
The big picture.
The script estimates that the total monthly cost for singles is somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 AUD.
Okay.
And for couples, it's 3,800 to 5,000 AUD.
All right, so still a noticeable difference.
Yes, and the person in the video actually says, teaming up saves you thousands a year.
Yeah, and looking at those numbers, that seems to be true.
It does. At the lower end of the range, it's a 1,300 AUD difference per month.
Right.
And at the higher end, it's 1,500 AUD more per month for couples.
So over a year, that really adds up.
It adds up big time.
Yeah.
Especially with the shared housing costs.
Exactly.
But here's the thing, and this is really important for our listeners to remember. Those average figures, they need context.
Yeah, they're a starting point.
Right, because the script really stresses that your lifestyle is going to have a huge impact on these numbers.
Oh, absolutely.
It even gives some examples like, that avocado toast habit we all have?
Yeah.
That could add up to an extra 10 AUD a week. Or those weekend getaways.
Oh, yeah.
Those can really inflate your costs. So why is it so crucial for our listeners to remember that these are just averages?
Because, they give you a general idea. But your spending habits and your lifestyle, how you choose to live, that's what's going to determine your actual expenses.
Exactly right.
Someone who eats out all the time, goes to fancy shows, travels a lot.
Yeah.
They're going to have higher costs than someone who's more budget conscious.
Right.
And the type of accommodation you choose, that's also huge.
Huge, yeah.
So those examples in the script are key to understanding that it's the personal choices that really drive your cost of living.
Absolutely. So as we've been unpacking this video script, what would you say is the main takeaway about the cost of living in Australia for singles versus couples?
I'd say the biggest thing is that generally living as a couple in Australia seems to offer some pretty significant financial advantages
Yeah.
compared to living alone,
Yeah.
mostly because you can share that big, expensive housing.
Right.
Plus, there's that potential for savings with things like bulk grocery shopping.
Hmm.
But, and this is super important, these are just averages
Yeah.
based on the info in this script.
Yeah.
Your own lifestyle choices, everything from your daily routines to your big spending decisions on leisure and travel.
Yeah.
That's going to be the ultimate factor in determining your real monthly and annual expenses.
That's such a good point. So for our listeners out there, here's a final thought to consider.
Okay.
As you've heard about all these different costs, rent, food, transport, lifestyle, which one do you think would have the biggest impact on your potential budget if you were to live in Australia? And how might your current spending habits in those areas translate to the costs we've discussed?
Interesting.
It's worth really thinking about that, maybe as you start to explore specific cities or regions, that might be a good fit for you.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was fun.
It was fun.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.